Hello and welcome to this webinar, which is covering the topics of how to deliver sustainability through traceable supply chains. We're going to look through this webinar initially at defining sustainability for your organization, and then move into looking at how traceability can be used to manage risk within the leather supply chain and deliver sustainable outcomes. So my name is Peter Hughes. I'm the sustainability lead for Eurofins PLC. And we'll start from now. So to begin with, I'd like to say that it's important to recognise that the word sustainability is used a lot at the moment, and there's a lot of subjectivity based around what that meaning of that word is. In fact, if you ask several people in the same room what sustainable means to them, you'll probably get lots of different answers. For example, the ability to maintain something at a certain rate or level is a perfectly good definition of sustainability, just sustaining something. It doesn't have any ethical or environmental connotations associated with it, but it is a definition that certainly some people might have. Another definition could be conserving an ecological balance by avoiding depletion of natural resources, a very environmentally focused understanding. And a lot of people do recognize sustainability as an environmentally focused issue. You'll also hear sustainability being referred to as something that is upholding or defending good practice without necessarily defining why. And I think that's certainly an increasing use of the word sustainable in business. My preferred definition is something along the lines of this. Sustainability is an activity that enhances social capital through the balanced use of economic capital without depleting environmental capital. So what this means is looking at the three key pillars of sustainability: social questions, economic questions, and environmental questions. And by recognizing that all three of those elements combined and ensuring that all three of those elements are being enhanced through any activity ensures sustainability going forward. So what we are saying is for your organization to be successful when looking at questions of sustainability, it's important to define it for your organization. Understand what sustainability means for your organization. It can mean different things, but understanding and getting some cohesion within your organization as to what it means is crucial to success. I think it's also fair to say that sustainable thinking is no longer a peripheral idea or activity. It is increasingly becoming aware by organizations that it's just good business and how effective operations should work. And by integrating sustainability effectively in your organization, you can actually add commercial value. You can protect your brand. And you can ensure longevity, long-term longevity of your organization. When looking at sustainability and looking at making publicly communicable statements, it's important to be authentic in what you're saying. If you make statements that cannot be backed up by facts, then you are potentially putting yourself at risk. And so being authentic in your storytelling is extremely important when communicating about sustainability. Now, for brands and organizations who use materials to produce a product, it's important to recognize that the majority of sustainable impact is actually within the material supply chain of the product. In the material supply chain, in the manufacture of that material, and at the end of life of that material, that product. How a brand tackles these issues, which are outside of the direct control of the brand, but within their sphere of influence, differentiates how well a brand has a sustainability response. So organizations that recognize the impact of their material supply chain and the end of life of their products and actively engage with those challenges are organizations that are leading the way in terms of managing sustainability. So with that in mind, and looking up the supply chain of the material supply, questions of traceability are really the most important starting points. Without understanding where your materials originate or the flow of those materials in the manufacture into your product, it's very hard to understand where your risk is and how to start managing and mitigating against those risks. Traceability is a really hot topic right now, as the industry is recognizing that good traceability is really a fundamental part of solving and, as I say, managing risk. And there are multiple different drivers for organizations looking at traceability, particularly environmental and social challenges globally. For the leather industry, one of the major environmental challenges is deforestation. The cattle industry is certainly responsible for certain parts of deforestation, and leather being a byproduct of that industry, there is a material footprint and responsibility in understanding whether that material footprint is being sourced from regions that could be exposed to deforestation. Increasingly, financial organizations are asking questions of organizations regarding where their materials originate from as part of investment decisions. And if an organization is unable to answer with enough clarity as to where their materials originate from, accessing investment could be challenging. We're also seeing increasing new legislation coming online, which is driving organizations to improve the traceability of their materials. Depending on where you sit within the supply chain, you might be having your customers asking questions of where your products come from. And to a certain extent, consumers are also starting to ask questions of material supply, although this is still in a minority. In addition, there are industry programs and certification programs, for example, Textile Exchange, which are asking questions of traceability as a requirement for participation and certification within those programs. And as I've said, traceability can form the basis of a strategic response to managing risk within supply chains. So there are multiple drivers as to what bringing organizations towards traceability, and you may be experiencing multiple of those that might be bringing you to this question. So what does the leather supply chain look like? Well, in general, we've put a schematic here, which shows a sort of a generalized version of how the leather supply chain operates. Major drivers of the bovine material supply chain are South America, North America, and Australia. You'll often see material being produced in these countries and then semi-processed into potentially a wet blue or a pickled form, and then transported to Asia for leather manufacturing. That material can be transported again within Asia for further finishing, or potentially transported to Europe for further finishing. And then finally, that leather is manufactured into a product ready for the consumer. As you can see, the leather industry is a multi-stepped industry in terms of that raw material all the way through to finished leather. It's a highly interconnected supply chain. Leather, as I've said, is the byproduct of the livestock industry. Every country in the world has a livestock industry of some scale or other, and therefore leather has the potential to originate in every single country in the world. And just to give you an indication of some statistics and how to illustrate this, if you look at the Italian leather industry, so the Italian leather industry has a significant brand in itself as a high quality material. If you look at the livestock industry of Italy, the entire livestock herd of Italy could only service around 10% of the Italian leather industry. And what that means is at least 90% of Italian leather in its raw form, its raw material form, must originate outside of Italy. And the reason why we highlight this is it's important for an organization to ask the question, where does my raw material come from? Because it may not be the same country of origin that your product comes from, or the finished leather that you're buying comes from. And without understanding where that raw material comes from, it's hard to understand what your key sustainability challenges are. To give you an idea of scale, This is a footwear retailer that we mapped a while back, and they had 40 tier 1 finished leather suppliers that they were in direct commercial agreement with. These 40 leather suppliers were sourcing from 160 tier 2 tanneries, who in turn were sourcing from 480 tier 3 slaughterhouses. Now, we estimated that those slaughterhouses were sourcing from up to 1.2 million tier 4 farms, which had a potential bovine footprint of over 24 million cattle. And now that's not to say that every single one of those animals ended up in that footwear supply chain, but that footwear retailer certainly had a potential influence on that scale of numbers. And really what this shows you, as you go up the supply chain, the numbers increase and the complexities increase. And it's important to be aware that as you go up the supply chain, the numbers do tend to increase. So this is a schematic of how the leather supply chain works. So you as a brand might be over in the right-hand side of this schematic. And you'll probably have good understanding and good connections with your product manufacturers who you're immediately buying from. You might also buy finished leather or have a good understanding of where your finished leather is coming from. However, leather is a multi-stepped manufacturing process, and there can be multiple different organizations involved in the manufacture of the leather. And therefore, understanding what that manufacturing process looks like within your supply chain may require additional work. And it might be that you don't know where the earlier steps are coming from. Then you move back to the raw material for leather. So that is the raw hide or skin. And that will often originate from a slaughterhouse, if from an industrialized processing, or can originate from traders collecting up skins in non-industrialized slaughtering situations. Beyond that, you've then got the livestock industry, so the farming industry, and animals can and often enter into the slaughterhouse section from a finishing farm or fattening farm, but animals can be traded and increased in weight by additional farms further up the supply chain prior to getting to that fattening farm. And we call these indirect farms. And there's potentially large numbers of these indirect farms within a supply chain. So what we say for the leather industry is you probably have good visibility of your immediate suppliers. You may or may not have data around your leather finishing. At BLC, we can support you to understand what your leather manufacturing footprint might look like. And we target getting back to the slaughterhouse for that raw material sourcing. We do, however, say it's very challenging to get information beyond the slaughterhouse in the farming industry. It is possible, and we have been able to achieve this, but it is challenging. And so expectations should be managed about what is possible for getting visibility beyond the slaughterhouse level. This is because the livestock industry traceability systems vary from country to country, so it would depend what country you're sourcing from. And because leather is a byproduct of the livestock industry, any traceability of the animal tends to stay with the meat or products that are originating from the animal, rather than from the hide, which is often considered a semi-waste product and can be stacked and grouped, and the traceability from those animals can be lost. So without physical marking of the hide at that slaughtering process, it's very challenging to have that animal traceability into the farm level. And so what we say is, really, as an organization from leather perspective, you should be looking at identifying where the slaughterhouses are within your supply chain. Why is it important to understand these issues? Well, what we've got here are the key sustainability sensitivities and risks for the leather industry. And these really are the key sustainability challenges. And I'm just going to run through these in a little bit of high level, just to articulate what they are. And then we can show how these can start to be addressed by understanding the traceability of that supply. So first of all, any question around sustainability will inevitably include the question of carbon and the carbon impact. Leather, in the leather manufacturing state, there is a carbon impact through leather manufacturing, but actually the fact that leather comes from as a byproduct of the livestock industry, that's really where the major carbon impact is. Like the livestock industry has a significant carbon footprint globally. And understanding what proportion of that livestock carbon footprint should be allocated to leather is an important consideration for understanding how leather would compare to other materials from a carbon footprint perspective. Allocations range from less than 1% up to around about 7%, depending on how you consider it. If you look at it from the weight or mass of the hide compared to the animal, that can be up to around 7% of the overall animal. The economic allocation can be 3% or less. And it's important for an organization to define how much allocation they recognize that the carbon footprint of the livestock industry should be of their leather. And this is actually open for debate. There's no clear answer on this, but it would be useful for an organization to determine what they feel is the accurate or right carbon allocation for them in order to help define leather as a material relative to other materials from a carbon perspective. The next key point, as I said, is deforestation. We've already touched on this in this webinar already. So deforestation is a hot topic for the leather industry, with a lot of organizations starting to question whether deforestation exists within their supply chain. And increasingly, as I say, financial institutions and legislators are starting to ask questions around or questions of brands to prove that they don't have material that originates from land that has been deforested. And traceability is an absolutely fundamental way of starting to answer that question. Animal welfare is another unique challenge really for leather in comparison to other competitor materials. The fact that leather comes and originates from an animal in its original origin means that the welfare of that animal is an important consideration, and how a brand recognizes and starts to tackle the issue of animal welfare is important for a brand's reputation. Of course, it is challenging for the leather industry because the leather industry is a byproduct of the livestock industry, and the animal welfare of the animal naturally tends to sit within the livestock industry. But nevertheless, leather has a responsibility as a material to recognize the welfare of animals within the supply chain. The value of the hide or skin is unusual for the leather industry because it fluctuates. Unlike other materials which have a relatively constant value, the value of leather changes. This is because leather is a byproduct of another industry. The demand increase or decrease of leather does not affect the slaughtering rates of animal and therefore the availability of raw material. Likewise, the demand for meat is not affected by the demand for leather. So what that means is if there is an oversupply of hides and skins due to an increased demand for meat, there will be an increased availability of hides, which will ultimately decrease the value of those hides. And managing this flux in value of hide and skins is something that the leather industry has to absorb, which is unusual to other industries. I've mentioned that leather is a byproduct of the livestock industry, and this is true for the four key leather material species, so bovine, ovine, caprine, and porcine. However, there are other sources for leather, and we call these exotic raw materials. So, for example, alligator or snake skin. These types of materials, these exotic raw materials, do not follow the same path as being byproducts of another industry. In fact, these materials are farmed specifically for their skins and therefore have a different risk portfolio associated with them. And for this presentation, we're concentrating predominantly on the four main leather species rather than the exotic species. We then start to move into the key challenges of the actual manufacturing stage of leather. So turning leather from its raw state into something that would be considered finished leather is a chemically intensive process. And how that chemistry is managed is an important consideration from an environmental and social perspective within leather manufacture. A link to that, of course, is the effluent. So chemistry in and looking at effluent out and how that effluent is treated is a significantly important consideration for the leather industry. Both those issues are covered within Leather Working Group, which is the environmental performance protocol for the manufacturing industry for leather. We've got on here as also modern slavery. So modern slavery is a potential challenge across most manufacturing. It's unfortunate to say that there are high levels of modern slavery existing in countries which have a significant leather industry. That's not to say that modern slavery is necessarily within the leather manufacturing industry or within your supply chain, but it's certainly a case that there is a risk of it being there. And unless you understand where your materials are coming from and who is manufacturing your materials, it's challenging to know whether you do have modern slavery as a risk. And so it's important to start to investigate in order to determine whether modern slavery is something that you need to be aware of. We've got on here NGO campaigns. NGOs are extremely effective at helping consumers and governments understand where the environmental and social risks are, and they play an important part in educating. And as a result, the leather industry needs to be able to respond to these campaigns effectively and recognise the issues that these campaigns are driving. I put in their worker environment as a social consideration, and this is linked to the manufacturing of the material, looking at how those workers are treated to ensure that they have appropriate health and safety and other working conditions appropriate to the material that they're working with is an important social consideration towards social compliance. Waste management. So this waste can be considered a challenge both in the manufacturing of material and products and also the end of life of that product. Trying to look at minimizing waste in the manufacturing process and the long-term circular economy question of the end of life of your product is an important consideration. Leather is an interesting material because it originates in its raw form from a byproduct of another industry. So it's a waste form from another industry. So it's effectively recycling a waste from another industry in the first place. But it also has the potential to biodegrade, seeing as in its raw form prior to being turned into leather, it would naturally biodegrade. And there are increasing investigations as to whether biodegradability of leather is something that can be promoted more fully. And also looking at the different chemical composition into the manufacture of leather, because if you have a product that has a product life cycle of about 5 years, and you're producing leather to make that product that will last 50 or 60 years, there's over-engineering and therefore additional chemistry going into that product that could be reduced. And so looking at what is the right lifespan for your leather relative to the product could be an area that some more efficiencies could be made. And finally, consumer trends and alternative materials. Leather is under pressure at the moment from other materials operating in the same space that have don't have some of the animal welfare or potentially deforestation challenges associated with those materials. And how leather responds to those other materials is again an important long-term sustainability consideration for leather itself. So what we say is, in order to begin to manage some of these challenges from a sustainability perspective, first of all, you need to map your supply chain. Once you've mapped it, and you can start to know what it looks like, and then you can start to understand it and finally respond effectively. And this is the system of traceability that you can start to use to manage risk, to mitigate against some of those sustainability challenges that I've just talked through. So at Eurofins BLC, we have an established traceability system or supply chain mapping system. The way our project works, we'd like to work collaboratively with our clients to understand what it is that they are trying to achieve through any traceability system, because it's possible to modify the project to ensure that it targets particular areas that a client is interested in. For example, Is a client more interested in an environmental perspective, a social perspective, maybe commercial relationships? And this ties back into the very beginning of this presentation where I said it's important to define what sustainability means for you. We can ensure that a traceability system actively targets the key sustainability issues that you as an organization are interested in. What we do is we then launch the project, and we have developed a supplier questionnaire which we can modify depending on the particular requirements of the client. And that is an online questionnaire. It's been developed over several years and refined over several years, and we found that having an online questionnaire with closed field questions as much as possible allows us to generate good quantifiable data that can then be assessed by us and used to identify potential risk within a supply chain. We ask our clients to distribute the questionnaires, as our clients have the commercial relationship within their supply chain and have the influence as customers within the supply chain to request information from the supply chain. But we're able to track that data as it comes in live to see what part of the supply chain is responding effectively. We then review that data and at a desktop exercise ensure the validity of that data based on cross-checking whether it makes sense within the supply chain itself. We check against other certification statuses that are publicly available, for example, the Leather Working Group certification status, particularly for leather. And then we plot this information and create a supply chain map. We do our regional data analysis and risk assessment on the results, and then we prepare a report for the client. Finally, we present the report to the client in the form of an interactive story map. So this is a presentation which has an interactive mapping built into it. And we encourage our customers to ensure as many of their stakeholders can be on that presentation as possible, because traceability is relevant across different parts of an organization, and the more parts of that organization understand the supply chain, the more effective that organization can be in responding to these issues. And finally, we hand that project over along with some training as to how to use the map. And the actual exercise itself of doing a traceability exercise and producing the map is a reportable activity in sustainability reporting in an annual report. And so not only can it give you a good understanding of where your risk is and how to start responding to those risks, but it actually can be used to show and demonstrate activity and progress against a sustainability strategy overall, and as I say, in final year reporting. So this is a screenshot of what the supply chain could look like. This isn't real data, this is just an example set of data, but it's reflective of what we might see. A real supply chain map is usually significantly more populated than this. But in this example, you have a brand located, in this case, in the UK, represented by that orange triangle, and they're sourcing from two different tier 1 suppliers from finished leather, one located in Italy and the other located in Hong Kong. And those two finished suppliers are then sourcing their leather in from different places. So the Italian supplier is sourcing wet blue material predominantly from within Europe and specifically within Italy itself. And that's represented by those two blue dots in Italy. And then those suppliers are in turn sourcing their raw material from slaughterhouses, mainly located within Europe, but also in North Africa as well. And then they have chemical suppliers highlighted there in yellow, again in Europe, but also chemistry in Asia as well. The other supplier located in China, in Hong Kong, is sourcing material predominantly from Brazil. They do have some other Asian sourcing, but and Australian sourcing, but the main source comes from Brazil, from those wet blue suppliers located in southern Brazil. And then those wet blue suppliers in turn are sourcing from slaughterhouses located in Brazil, but also other countries and regions within South America. And what we can do from this exercise is start to build a determination of risk, of the key risks that we've looked at earlier on, sustainability risks of the supply chain. And what we would say here immediately jumps out to us is there are slaughterhouses located in Brazil within this supply chain for this brand, and therefore we would need to investigate that. So this is one of the overlays that we do, and we can overlay multiple different data sets onto the results of a traceability exercise. In this case, what we've done is we've taken Brazil and we've looked at the levels of deforestation by municipality within Brazil. And each of the municipalities, we can look at the total number of deforestation that has occurred in the last 20 years by total area and also by percentage. And what we can do is if we identify a slaughterhouse located in Brazil, we can then draw a ring around that location to determine the likely distance that that slaughterhouse is being serviced by. In this case, a 100-kilometer radius ring. And then we can make a determination based on the deforestation rates within that 100-kilometer radius as to the potential deforestation risk that that particular slaughterhouse might have. So if an organization identifies that it has multiple different slaughterhouses located in risk areas within Brazil, we're able to provide an analysis of this, a priority of risk, so identifying which slaughterhouses are potentially at the greatest level of risk, and it supports our clients to begin to not only determine if there's a challenge there and the type of risk they might be exposed to, but also a priority of response. So how could they respond to this by actively going and speaking to that supply chain and starting to determine what sort of responses there are to the potential risk of deforestation. So if within a supply chain we're able to identify the top 5 riskiest slaughterhouses, for example, a brand can then work with their supply chain to engage with those slaughterhouses and understand what evidence those slaughterhouses can provide to ensure that they're not sourcing from material farmed in recently deforested areas. And this provides a really effective way that a brand can start to respond to the challenges and questions of potential deforestation within their supply chain. So to conclude, conclude this presentation, defining traceability is the first step towards understanding what the right amount of capacity investment an organization should commit to responding to sustainability. The next step really is introducing an effective traceability system. And for leather, the key sustainability risks are, as I've already discussed. By introducing a traceability system on the leather supply chain, it's possible to start to manage your risk within your supply chain. By doing so, you can start to make better informed decisions and respond to scrutiny. You can comply with legislation. You can better understand your environmental and ethical risks. You can better understand your deforestation risk. And as an organization, you can respond more effectively to both financial investment queries and also potentially NGO queries. The way we operate on a traceability project is to begin by scoping the project. We then build a questionnaire, generate the tannery and supplier data, produce a risk map, assess the risk and respond and develop a story map to portray this risk and then present these results to the client. So that concludes this presentation. The key takeaway is that traceability is really the best way to start to understand where your risk is. And by undertaking an effective traceability exercise, you can begin to respond effectively to those sustainability risks within your supply chain. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I believe there is a question and answer session that you can put your questions to and we can start to respond to. Thank you very much.